Hi, it's Ted Morrissey, and I'm making a video for my Southern New Hampshire University course in Advanced Creative Writing, and particularly the idea of mixing forms. That when we write, no matter what our primary focus might be, fiction or poetry or screenwriting or what have you, creative nonfiction, that we certainly can play with combining multiple forms together, which can make for really interesting work. And my announcement speaks to this in particular. So in this video, I really want to just kind of hit some of my favorite books that do this sort of thing. And so I've got my big bookcase shelf thing behind me. I just sort of grabbed here and there some books that I truly love just to share with. And I wanted to grab some books that you probably are familiar with for the most part. There might be one or two here that are a little more obscure, but I think anyone who's an English major type person, they probably will at least have heard of, the writers and books that I'm talking about for the most part. I'm going to begin with talking about this guy, Edgar Allan Poe. He was quite the prolific author. Obviously wrote poetry and fiction and criticism and all kinds of things. But one of the things I wanted to kind of point out, and this is kind of a fairly straightforward mixing of forms. In other words, it's not too wild, but his classic story, The Fall of the House of Usher, which I'm sure you've read or at least have heard of as you've studied Poe over the years. Obviously, we study his poem, The Raven, and, there are other classic tale story or Poe stories rather, like The Telltale Heart and Murders in the Rue Morgue and things like that, The Cask of Amontillado, and on and on and on. But I really like The Fall of the House of Usher, and it's mainly prose. As you know, it's about the narrator who goes to visit his sort of childhood friend, Broderick Usher. But during the course of his stay, Usher plays a song, which we get in the form of a poem, basically, right? A ballad. And it is the Haunted Palace, right? And so Poe sticks this poem, ballad, in the midst of this story, and it illuminates in many ways a lot of the themes and ideas that Poe is talking about elsewhere in the story. So it's mostly prose fiction, but inserted into that is some of Poe's poetry, very strictly rhymed and metered. And it just adds a whole nother layer, a whole nother level of sophistication to the story. So if you haven't read The Fall of the House of Usher for a while, or if you haven't read it at all, I definitely would encourage you to track it down. Obviously, there are plenty of places online you can find it, and check it out. All right. Another older piece that you're probably familiar with the title, but you may not have read, I didn't read it till much later in life, is Tolstoy's War and Peace. It's quite the tome, and actually, when I finished my doctorate, I looked back over the landscape of my education as an English major, then getting my master's in English, and then getting my doctorate in English, and then having taken several graduate courses in English from this university or that university over the years. And I realized there were all these gaps in my reading. And in spite of all that reading and all that coursework, there still were authors I wish I knew more about, and Tolstoy was one of them, and particularly this classic War and Peace. So after I finished my doctorate, I set off on this sort of self-styled reading list, and it included War and Peace. And we think of War and Peace as a novel, but that's kind of hard to say. Yes, there definitely is a narrative element to it, a novel type element where you have, fictional characters, and they're doing all the things that fictional characters do in terms of falling in love, falling out of love, having conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. But mixed throughout are all these different things. For example, Tolstoy rather was thinking about the Napoleonic Wars, and he was analyzing the various battles in great detail. He would go to the various battlefields and take copious notes and read all kinds of historical accounts of the battles, because he was writing about 70 years or so after the Napoleonic Wars, so it wasn't a fresh memory or a memory at all for him, really. And so part of what War and Peace is about is a historical description of the battles, the different generals. Napoleon is talked about, as well as other real historical figures, and Tolstoy's analysis of their battlefield tactics and what was effective and what wasn't, and what's been sort of mythologized, and so forth. And again, we get this sort of sporadically throughout the novel, again, calling it a novel. It's also Tolstoy dealing with his past, and dealing with what he did as a young soldier, not during the Napoleonic Wars, because again, this is later, but his own sort of past. So we get these autobiographical elements, narrative, memoir thrown into the story as well. And Tolstoy was sorting out his own sort of philosophical ideas about Christianity and the way, people should treat each other and how landowners should treat peasants, and on and on and on. And so all that philosophical, theological sort of stuff gets into the book as well. So is it a novel? Yes. Is it history? Yeah. Is it historical analysis of battlefield tactics? Yes. Is it autobiography? Yeah. Is it philosophy and theology? Yeah. It's all that stuff, right? All mixed together in one really complex work. Another classic novel that I didn't read until after I'd finished my doctorate, and now I actually teach a course in it, is James Joyce's Ulysses. And as you may be familiar, it's considered by many the greatest novel written in the English language. Not by everybody, but by some people. And in it, Joyce combines all kinds of different modes. It starts off largely fairly traditional, fictional mode, talking about the various characters of the novel. But eventually, he starts throwing all kinds of things in. He starts throwing in song. He starts throwing in poetry. He eventually morphs into play form, and so we get one section, one episode completely in the form of a play. In one episode, he decides to give us the evolution of the English language, and so he starts off writing in a very primitive kind of English, kind of old English, and then kind of moves historically through different kinds of writers and as English evolved over the centuries and so forth. So he's doing all kinds of things in this novel. He doesn't limit himself to just straightforward fictional narrative. All right. Some other books that I want to share with you, again, maybe familiar, probably not in some cases, is this is one of my favorites. This is probably a book you haven't heard of because it was very popular back in the 1980s. So I remember very well when it was a bestseller, but it's kind of fallen out of favor. Not too many people talking about The White Hotel by the author D.M. Thomas. But D.M. Thomas was mainly a poet, but he got into novel writing for a time and wrote some very popular novels. Like I said, The White Hotel was a mega hit for a time. But in it, Thomas plays with all kinds of forms. It begins in letter writing form, as you can see. So we get several pages in the beginning of letters between various characters. Then he switches to poetry, and we get a section entirely in poetry. It's narrative poetry. It's telling the same story that he is developing. And then after the poetry, we morph into just regular sort of novel writing prose. So we go from epistolary to poetry to prose, fictional prose, all telling the same story, all being used to advance the narrative that he is telling. But really, really interesting. D.M. Thomas and The White Hotel. Another book that you probably are familiar with, at least by reputation if you haven't actually read it yourself, is Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five. And as you may know, Slaughterhouse-Five combines a couple of different modes. Vonnegut was a prisoner of war during World War II when he was a young man, and he was imprisoned in Dresden, Germany, which was firebombed by the Allies while Vonnegut was there as a prisoner, and he survived it, obviously. And so part of what this novel is about is Vonnegut's actual straightforward memoir of his time in Dresden as a prisoner of war. So he talks about that periodically, and again, not in a kind of veiled way, but very straightforwardly as the author of this book, talking about his own definite life experiences as a young man in Dresden, Germany during the war. But it's also this weird sci-fi story about the main character, Billy Pilgrim, being abducted by aliens. And he just kind of ping pongs back and forth between his personal memoir and this story about alien abduction. And they actually are related thematically and so forth, but on first encounter, it just seems like we're going everywhere. But the personal memoir, legitimate. The things that he writes about really did happen to him. His thoughts and his feelings, he's trying to sort out about what happened and how it affected him are definitely in here, just like kind of straightforward memoir, but it's also a wild sci-fi narrative about Billy Pilgrim being abducted by aliens. So check out Slaughterhouse-Five. The last one I'll share with you is by the Russian author Vladimir Nabokov, probably best known for his controversial and best-selling novel Lolita. But Nabokov is a really fascinating writer. He began writing in Russian, since he's from Russia. And so for 30 years, he wrote in Russian. Occasionally, he would write something in French, which was another of his languages that he was proficient in. But eventually, he decided that he wanted to switch to English. And so for the last 20 years of his career or so, he wrote exclusively in English. And this is one of his English language written novels, Pale Fire. But it's very, very strange. It is about a poet named John Shade, who has written this long narrative poem. And he is befriended by his next door neighbor, who's an academic. And his neighbor decides that he is going to do a sort of academic commentary, a sort of glossary, commenting on his friend's long narrative poem. And so it begins with a foreword, which usually when we encounter a foreword in a novel, it's written, about the book, and it's legitimate, kind of preparation for us reading the book. But there's a fictive foreword. It's written by, Dr. Cabote, the next door neighbor, who then talks about his relationship with the great poet John Shade. And then after this fictional foreword, we actually get into the poem Pale Fire by John Shade, which was written on a series of note cards, we're told. And it's very definitely in poetic stanza form. And it's a narrative poem, so it tells kind of a story in and of itself. And so then Dr. Cabote has decided to, like I said, give a commentary on his friend's poem. But here's the thing. He manages to turn every reference in the poem to being something about him. And so it becomes quite interesting and comical at times to read how the academic is so narcissistic that he thinks this poem is actually about him. And so he somehow twists and turns every phrase and every image into something about himself. When I first read this book and kind of knew what it was about, I actually read the commentary first. And then after I read the commentary, I went back and read the poem. And anyway, it just made for, I think, a more interesting way to read it. So combining academic writing, kind of fake academic writing, poetry, and then novel writing, but in the form of academic commentary on a poem. Right. And these are just a few examples. I could make this a really long video because my shelves are filled with books where authors do this sort of thing where they combine various modes into a single story, a single book, a single whatever, because it's a very popular way to operate as a writer. And it's a lot of fun, which I talk about in the announcement that accompanies this video. So I'm going to stop there. Those are just a few examples of well-known or maybe lesser well-known books where the authors combine various modes of narrative. And the final product was very enjoyable and a lot of, and also got a lot of success as well. All right.